There's some really significant changes in post-16, and it's quite a kind of radical relative to some of the other areas section of the bill, Act, as it now is. Essentially, the first big radical change I referred to this morning but didn't go into in any detail, and that is this is a plan that now goes to 25 years of age. And so learning difficulty assessments and the fact that post-16 you didn't have the same kind of rights and protections that a statement gave you before 16 have changed. And it may be one of the big drivers for some people whose children and young people are coming up to this age to want to get an education, health and care plan early, because actually it will give you more entitlements, probably, than the old LDA would. Certainly legally it does. Whether that translates into more provision is of course more questionable. And there's also some more general duties that change because of this as well. And so it's that I want to take you through in the last session. So firstly, in relation to post-16 provision, it must cover how local authorities and house services plan strategically for the support of children and young people to prepare for adult life. So this is back to that strategic duties bit I talked about, where they've got to get together and plan services for adult life. And that was one of the issues that was coming up in the question session this morning, again, in terms of making sure that actually there's a more coordinated approach and a better offer for young people post-16 and then post-18. They've now got a duty to plan together to do that. How early years providers, schools and colleges should enable children and young people to have the information and skills to gain independence and prepare for adult life. And again, this is reflecting what I was talking about, and that focus on having skills and independence from very early on as a preparation for adult life. And they're actually almost starting in the early years. So all the way through, we're expecting children and young people with SEN and disability to be having their independence and their capacity and their resilience and their outcomes supported. So by the time they get to adult life, they're prepared for that and able to do that. Certainly, they're still keeping this focus on, by year 9 at the latest, including the content of preparing for adult reviews for children and young people within education, health and care plans. So although we may have abolished LDAs, learning disability assessments, we obviously haven't abolished a transition process. Everybody accepts that in coming up to 16, life changes for all young people, and that young people with SEN and disability may need more support. So there's still got to be a transition process, and that needs to be reflected then in any provision for an education, health and care plan, and how that plan starts to plan for the next stage of planning into post-16 provision. And then there's also more requirements now on how post-16 institutions can design study programs to create pathways for employment, how young people should be supported to make decisions for themselves. Packages of provision for children and young people with the EHC plans should at least be across 5 days a week. The Code of Practice is saying that typically you should be looking at provision that moves across 5 days a week. But that can be very different sorts of provision. That's not just talking about everything having to be in college time. You should be looking at what other provision you can put in place to make that happen. So that could be education, it could be training, it could be supported internships, it could be other kind of experience that's building that young person's capacity. But colleges should be looking to provide comprehensive package of support, typically over 5 days. You can't absolutely legislate for it being 5 days, but that's what the government is saying the expectation is. And then you should be looking at how young people can transition into higher education, into adult health services, into adult social care, and how they can transition from leaving education and progressing into employment. So this is the 18 plus part of the whole picture. Within that, further education colleges have got additional duties because of the new legislation. They have a duty to cooperate with the local authority on arrangements for children and young people with SEN. And this is a reciprocal duty. This is just a fancy word for they both got to do it. Okay? So local authorities got to cooperate with the college and vice versa. And this is where you get some of the really interesting bits in terms of young people's rights and additional rights for young people within the whole system. So the young person, if they or their parents will jointly have chosen an institution which is named in the Education, Health and Care Plan, that institution now has to admit them, subject to the other caveats I talked about this morning in terms of it being appropriate and being the right provision for that person and that institution being able to meet their needs. But if in the judgment of the local authority and that the young person or parents still agree with that, then they must be allowed to go to that provision. And that's a kind of stronger duty than existed before in terms of the LDAs, okay? All FE colleges have the duty to have regard to the code of practice in the future and other kinds of provision. So even if it's an employment provision with that, they have to have a duty as far as it's relevant to have some regard to the code of practice. If it's support provided through the college. And they have the duty for the best endeavours, this best endeavours concept again, to secure the special education provision that the young person needs. And this duty applies to further education colleges, sixth form colleges, 16 to 19 academies. So most of the people you can think of that are providing this sort of provision have that duty that I talked about earlier to do their best endeavours, that high standard of trying to ensure that happens. The people it doesn't apply to are independent specialist colleges or special schools, as their principal purpose is to provide for people with SEN already. So they're saying if you're already a specialist college doing that, it's a bit odd talking about you've got to be use your best endeavours, because that's the whole reason you exist, is to do that in the first place. So why wouldn't you be? The best endeavours duty is try and capture that you've got to do the best you possibly can for children with SEN when there are other children in the school. And then there's a change in the legal responsibility around how long you can provide education before. Whereas before, again, there was a kind of cliff edge at 18/19. Under the new system, it at least becomes a bit more flexible. So what the local authority is required to look at is whether the educational or training outcomes specified in the plan have been achieved. And so if the outcomes haven't been achieved, it's not an absolute must, but the local authority must the must is they must at least look at whether further education provision should be provided to ensure that those outcomes are met. Okay? It's not a guarantee of education post-19, but you must look to see if those outcomes have been met. And if they have not, you certainly have the powers then as local authority to put more education provision in place. And this does not mean, I don't think anybody wants, that someone between 19 and 25 can therefore simply repeat a life skills course for another 5 years if their outcomes aren't improving in some way. But in terms of the outcomes, the educational outcomes set for that young person, there is a responsibility to look and see if they're being met before, if you like, they're discharged from the education system at that level. I know there's a lot of concern, a lot of issues for parents around, whose voice is listened to at this stage. And this becomes even more important when you remember, as I was saying earlier, that post-16 young people now have the right to ask for an education, health and care plan in their own right, ask for a personal budget as part of that education, health and care plan, if it would be appropriate as part of that provision, that if they weren't happy with the provision, to go to tribunal in their own right, ask to go to tribunal in their own right, and to be consulted about the provision around all of that. So what the Code of Practice says, or at least the draft one, I'm presuming the final one hasn't changed much in the wording around this, but I will have to just check, is that where a young person is under 18, the involvement of the parents is particularly important, and local authorities should continue to involve them in the vast majority of decisions. So it's not a must, it's a should, but what the government is saying is typically it's good practice to still be working in a partnership at that point between the young person and the parent and the local authority or education provision in anything that's going on. Schools and colleges normally involve parents and family members of students under 18 where they have concerns about a young person's attendance, behaviour or welfare, and they should continue to do so. They should also continue to involve parents or family members in discussions about the young person's studies where that is the usual policy. So, we all know there is a shift at 16 to a much greater focus on the young person and dealing with the young person. And that's part of kind of normalisation for all young people to go through this process. But we know that for many children, young people at this point with SEN and disability, they may still need further support, and parents may still be quite intimately involved in what's going on. And the government says that's fine. Okay, government says that's kind of good practice, that's what we would routinely expect to see. Whatever college has been doing, they would carry on doing that. Post 18, two things happen. Where relevant assessment and information exists, parents, young people and professionals are content with the statement or LDA, and there are no additional health and social care needs, where the personal budget is not sought, a transfer may use existing information and discussions with the children and young person. So this is about, for those young people that are on learning disability assessments now, you can either let them run through if you're happy with everything that's going on, or if you're happy with all that provision, the local authority can kind of convert those into an education, health and care plan. That's what the second bit is saying. A transfer may use existing information and discussions with the child, young person and their parents to develop a person-centred, outcomes-focused EHC plan. So if you've got an LDA and you want it converted and the information is there to do that and it all meets your needs, then you could look at that being a conversion to an EHC plan. Otherwise, you just kind of let it run through for the period that it's going if you're happy with what happens. And then at 18, when a young person with an EHC plan does not make the transition to adult services, both sets of statutory guidance make it clear that the assessment for adult services should be aligned with the annual review of the Education, Health and Care Plan, avoiding the need for separate, unconnected assessments. For those young people whose needs make them eligible for adult services, their resulting statutory care plan will form part or all of the care element of their EHC plan. So what it's saying is you kind of transfer into that planning process post 18, we should be looking to ensure that there's not kind of two sets of assessments for everything, that you actually start to bring this together where it's appropriate. And this is the statement I was talking about in relation to what those young people's rights are. So post-16, they have the right to make decisions under the Children's Families Act, applied to them directly rather than to their parents. Parents or the family members can continue to support the young people in making decisions or act on their behalf, provided that the young person is happy for them to do so, and it is likely that the parents will remain closely involved in the great majority of cases. And then second statement there, local authorities, schools and colleges, health services and other agencies should continue to involve parents in discussions about the young person's future, focusing on discussions around the individual young person. So again, they're trying to strike that balance between legally the rights and duties actually transfer onto the young person at 16. But typically, the way that would still work, especially around SEN and disability, is that parents will still be fairly intimately involved in what happens. But just to be clear to you, if there's a dispute between the parent and the young person about what should happen, and that can't be resolved with discussions between you and the service provider or the local authority, the legal duty on the local authority and provider is to go with the decision of the young person, subject to the Mental Capacity Act, which says that that person must be in the position to be able to make those decisions and understand the consequences of the decisions on themselves. So it's not absolute carte blanche that any 16-year-old of any level of mental capacity can actually take all these decisions for themselves. But the onus is on the decision-making being with the young person until proved otherwise, okay? But that only becomes an issue if there's a real conflict, obviously, if everybody's in agreement and works through it. But just so you're clear that is the legal position. So it's kind of quite complex and quite nuanced in terms of how that would all work. And as you can see, young people do get some fundamental rights in this, in terms of requesting the EHC plan, being eligible for a personal budget, being able to go to tribunal, being able to name where they want to go. And that all shifts both in terms of responsibilities given to young people that they didn't always have before, and because of the structure of the EHC plan, that it has become this 0 to 25 plan. I put it all up on there just so you've got it to refer to. I've just talked it all through, but just so you get very clearly what those new areas are. And the right to request an education, health and care plan doesn't end at 18. You can do so any time up to their 25th birthday. I just know there's a lot of issues around autism, so I just thought it's worth people being aware. This is not part of the education reforms at all. As a result of a completely separate bit of legislation, local authorities have to produce an autism strategy. And under that, SENCO should inform young people with autism of their right to community care assessment, and their parents have a right to a carer's assessment. And colleges should adopt the same approach. And this should be built into preparing for adult review meetings for those with education, health and care plans. So it's an extra kind of catch-all, if you like, for children with autism within the system because of these additional responsibilities that were put into a previous Local Government Act. And if you're wondering, well, why doesn't that apply to everyone? It was actually simply because the Autism Society was very effective at lobbying and getting this statutory duty put in to actually assess the needs of children and young people with autism on the local authority. So it's been reflected in some of the guidance because it's there as another statutory duty. But that's not something that's come out of the SEN reforms. And there's the criteria around the Mental Capacity Act, in case you were wondering. The right of young people to make a decision is subject to their capacity to do so, as set out in the Mental Capacity Act 2005. The underlying principle of the Act is to ensure that those who lack capacity are empowered to make as many decisions for themselves as possible, and any decision made or action taken on their behalf is done so in their best interest. So even if somebody's an individual 16-year-old person, if you like, fails, I mean, lawyers would kill me, but for these purposes, if they fail the Mental Capacity Act, it's more of a kind of slope. So you would still look for, well, what are the decisions that young person could legitimately take, even if they can't take all of them? And what support could be put in place so that they could make those decisions for themselves, or even if other adults are involved in those decisions, how can we structure it so they have the biggest possible contribution to making those decisions? So it's not a simple black and white, or either they can or they can't. As this states here very clearly, it's about trying to ensure they're supported to make as many decisions for themselves as possible. So that's it for me in terms of formal presentation. I'll take some questions on this in a minute, but one thing I wanted to leave you with, in terms of looking at all this, you know, what should we do, what should we not do, what does this mean, what does it all not mean? My younger daughter found this for me. Dear optimist, pessimist and realist, while you guys were busy arguing about the glass of water, I drank it sincerely, the opportunist. What I would encourage you to all do about this, and I want to encourage you to, again in the next exercise, is instead of wondering whether the glass is half full or half empty and what's this going to get us, what's it's not, and I understand that discussion, believe me, for this last bit of the session, I just want you to all be opportunists and say, well, whatever the nitty-gritty of the legislation says, what opportunities does it give us? Now you've heard the kind of rest of the picture, so you saw half the picture this morning and we had a discussion. Now you've seen the other half of the picture. What other opportunities does it give you on the new things you've heard, or reflecting more on what you heard this morning in terms of what you'd like to see change, what else you'd like to see done? So I'd want to have another kind of 20-25 minutes now, you discussing on tables what else you'd like to see happen from what you've heard this afternoon as a result of this. So this again can be fed back into the local authority.